If you hang about at all in that unpleasant area of the internet where politics and pop culture tend to merge into an unpleasant goop, you may have seen this McDonald's advert pop up a few times. Now, what interests me is less the far-right kind of reaction to this and trying to push it as some new cultural issue, but more the mistakes which are being made when viewing it and how it sort of connects to how we view race from our very Western-centric perspective, but also how that's not really wrong or that confusing, really. See, some on the right have seen this Japanese advert as an example of a commercial showing a white couple with a child and claiming it as some great example of standing up to like the Western corporate decadence of interracial couples and homosexuality or whatever. Meanwhile, those more to the left, or just those who want to dunk on what's currently a popular hate target, are saying it's an interracial couple. And there's plenty of fun to be made about this topic, but what interests me more is the general mistakes which are being made. See, I'm quite knowledgeable about Japanese pop culture, and I can instantly tell that neither of these characters are meant to be read as Caucasian. Both are clearly meant to be seen as Asian, but I don't think it's all that confusing why people might be a bit confused. See, you've really got to get your PhD in how Japan views the world versus the West to really understand a lot of this stuff. So I felt this ad was about as good an excuse as any to launch a video on this topic and hopefully get some confusing, messy ideas sorted out. Because this is going to be an attempt to be as objective and as non-partisan as I can on explaining this. So hopefully no one will go away all that happy. See, when we think of an Asian, we tend to think of the most exaggerated features we can, what distinctly makes them separate in appearance to, say, a white individual. And you've got to understand they kind of do the same, which is why of these three characters, the one who is the most Asian is the one who clearly has the least defining features. Okay, so I'm going to go a little into a bit of racial theories here, because there's a manga called Crying Freeman. This is kind of my bag when it comes to like Japanese like mass market lowbrow entertainment. This shit is basically the equivalent of like something like James Bond. It's very trashy, kind of male oriented sort of escapist fiction. You're gonna get a lot of fights, a lot of sex, a lot of attractive women. Every dude in here is like insanely built. Hopefully this doesn't get my channel banned again, because fortunately this is nowhere near as creepy as like Berserk or something in terms of what it has in there. For the most part, I'm sure it's got some decidedly uncomfortable stuff, but you know, it's meant more for normal men than like weirdo perverts, so you know, it's not quite on that Berserk level. Thing about Crying Freeman is it has a really good gag about how there's a bit where these detectives are trying to catch the main character, and they're doing that thing where they see a wall of different faces and they're going through them to try and find what he looks like, and they point out a good-looking man has no distinguishing characteristics. And I think unintentionally this probably describes why we tend to obsess over East Asian eyes and why they tend to point to European noses a lot. Because what is maybe considered the ideal appearance should be someone without any distinguishing characteristics. And to them, a nose is very distinguishing. Which is why, if you actually keep an eye out, you'll notice noses popping up a lot when it comes to how they design the faces of like more European characters versus Asian ones.
Canada has more international flights nowadays.
Finally.
Next stop, Vancouver.
Next stop, Hanoi.
Exciting, isn't it?
You want a hug? Such a Japanese reaction.
Because I am Japanese.
I see.
I will fly.
Let's change the image of Japanese people. Sure. Wanna go?
Yeah.
羽田から世界へ ANA
This doesn't necessarily mean that every character who's intended to be white will have this massive clear nose. It really depends on how they're meant to look. This is why a more attractive character, for example, probably has more neutral features, say a love interest, a main character, while a character may be portrayed more negatively, as is an unfortunate trope with fiction, is more likely to have more extreme, what would be seen as unusual features for a Japanese audience. E.g., this woman is massive, the tits are massive, the bulk is massive, the nose is more distinct. For Japanese, this is kind of weird and ugly. This is like a satirical depiction of a white woman. While, say, just having blonde hair, but otherwise being indistinguishable from all these other Japanese characters, yes, they're all meant to be Japanese, is seen as like attractive and, a bit more exotic, I guess, so to speak. One weird trope I've noticed with a bunch of Japanese fiction is this tendency to have characters who are mixed race but look very white, but only in what would be seen as appealing ways. E.g., there are a good few examples I can think of where you have very tall blonde women and they're like a quarter white or half white. It's definitely stands out. Once again, this is a weird sort of, I guess, fetishization thing, you could call it. Which I guess means it's about time I address something people are probably waiting on, which is to talk about characters who are not white or Asian. And this means I'm gonna have to defend Osamu Tezuka for a little bit. Because, sadly, due to a weird complex a lot of our more Japan-obsessed friends have, we've had a bit of an obsession with the idea that famous Disney movie The Lion King stole extensively from Osamu Tezuka's children's manga and TV show Kimba, which led to a fairly massively successful YouTube video doing a pretty good job of debunking a lot of that. And due to that, I'm afraid a lot of people probably now associate the guy with extreme racism, which I'm going to mostly disagree with, but I'm also going to acknowledge that Osamu Tezuka, I could do a whole hour-long video on him, and I have done hour-long talks on him in the past. So, it's not a simple subject. What I will say is that when you are dealing with someone who is drawing a lot, it's kind of a common observation, if you're a comedian or you're an artist or whatever, that cultural differences, including differences of appearance, tend to get radically exaggerated. Like, when you look at it, the average person doesn't look that different when it comes to their overall face. But yeah, Tezuka certainly liked his caricatures, and he did them a lot. And I know some people are gonna say he didn't know better. I think there's evidence he did, but we're not gonna go there yet. See, the core thing I was getting at by bringing up that Crime Freeman panel is Japan does not view itself as particularly Japanese looking, which is why a character like Naruto is instantly read as Japanese, while these depictions of the Beatles are instantly read as like British Caucasian. Part of the confusion is just that a lot of anime actually does look quite boring. Bluntly put, like, the style, which is most popular with most people in Western countries, most popular with the kids who are mostly viewing it, kind of looks like this. Insanely generic, basically barely any face, something which is extremely easy to project onto. But even things with a more expressive style can easily be projected onto by multiple ethnic groups. Good example of this is these characters from City Hunter, which was re-released in France as, what was the name? Nicky Larson. Yep, they changed the character's name to Nicky Larson, and it was successful enough to spawn an actual live action movie titled Nicky Larson. So there you go. Point is, this sort of non-extremely expressive face is quite easy to project onto, and City Hunter designs already look kind of Asian, but obviously not enough. Point is, when you're dealing with the difference between these two faces, it's not actually that hard to just see them as one or the other by just, cartoonerizing them. For example, look at this footage from this video game here. Do people know the character's Asian or not? Well, the answer is he is meant to be, and he's modelled off one. And this is a realistic-ish looking game from about 10 years back. Still not completely obvious that he's Asian. And to a degree, I would say at least some of this is intentional. If you look at, say, the recent Final Fantasy 15, I said recent, I mean that nearly a decade old Final Fantasy 15. The main characters, with the exception of this one, all could kind of pass as white or Asian. That guy looks like he could also kind of pass as Middle Eastern. I don't know. Thing is, they're realistic looking, but not realistic looking to clearly show an ethnicity. This is kind of why with something like The Simpsons, for example, all the characters with no clear ethnic markings are all read as white, while the ones with clear ethnic indicators can be read as other races. Similarly, when they've got like a Scottish guy, they clearly give him that sort of red hair to kind of indicate that he's Scottish, because they're heavily emphasising their ethnicity. Interestingly, the same thing kind of happened with something like Lego. Old Lego toys, for example, everyone was yellow, apart from, like, we've got Lando Calrissian here alongside Princess Leia and Luke Skywalker. Which one maintains their actual skin colour? Of course it's got to be the black one, because he's the one that stands out. And my point is, that's kind of why it's quite easy to read these characters as multiple ethnicities, which is why there was a whole trend of just taking Japanese stuff, changing the characters' names and pretending they took place in, like, America or sometimes other European countries, depending on what was being bought and who it was being marketed to. Probably one of the weirdest examples I can think of is Ace Attorney. Ace Attorney is a series of Japanese kind of murder detective lawyer games. The games have a very clear Eastern flavour, let's just put it that way. A bunch of the cases revolve around certain pop culture related things which make it clear they're set in Japan. A lot of the designs are very Japanese, which makes it comedically absurd that they kind of rewrote all these to take place in America. It's sort of crazy because this stuff isn't even aimed at, like, 5-year-olds. It's kind of marketed at more of a teens and older kind of demographic, e.g. not the sort of hard 18 rated crime stuff, that's my favourite type, but at least aimed at, people who understand what, like, a pedophile or what domestic homicide is, blah blah blah, e.g. it's not too graphic, but those topics get brought up from time to time. But anyway, the point is, these characters to me instantly read as East Asian, and maybe that's just because I'm more familiar with stuff which comes out of, like, Japan. But what I found comedic is they did a live action movie because, big franchise, gotta milk it, gotta keep the stuff going out. And yeah, what was humorous was Destructoid, a pretty major games reviewing sort of websites. They're not that big now, but I got plenty of stories of weirdly terrible Destructoid articles, but whatever. It's where you hang out online, you got some stories from there. But what's interesting is they review the live action movie and complain that it's weird that it's an Asian cast. Man, these characters, my interpretation of them was they were white as hell. And it's just kind of comedic to me because I'm like, I always found it really weird that they made any pretense that these titles weren't all starring Japanese people. And to Capcom's weird credit, one of the weirder things to come out of this whole, like, woke explosion, where everyone's a lot more careful and considerate when it comes to, you know, blah blah blah, certain ethnic depictions coming out of Japan, is that now this stuff just doesn't really happen anymore. Like now, when they're localizing something for the Western market, this weird little thing of, should we try and rewrite it to make it seem like they aren't Japanese, make it seem like they might be white. That doesn't really happen. But what's interesting is I don't think some of the racial neutrality stuff is necessarily unintentional. I think some of it is generally part of trying to get the largest market. If you want a reverse example of what I've been talking about, take a look at like the recent Spider-Man games on the PlayStation 4. When they re-released it on PlayStation 5, they changed the main character's look, and some might quite correctly think this is to make him look more like Tom Holland. But I'd also say it might be because they wanted him to look a little less white to appeal to maybe a larger market. I'm just floating the idea. So what about all the characters which are some vague ethnicity of no clear sort of origin? What about the characters that are actually white but sort of appear like almost Arab, like dark skinned? What about all that mess? What about the guy that appears green despite being like Roman? Well, I can actually drag this stuff back to Tezuka also. Doing a lot of... You'll notice this a lot with children's animation. A lot of the time this stuff doesn't really design a character around a clear ethnicity but more around a vague idea. That's why with a lot of this kids stuff you kind of get these weird bubblegum jelly baby kind of effect characters, e.g. why is someone green? And what's interesting about Caesar here in Tezuka's Cleopatra is that I think he's probably green just to give a sort of statue look. So let me give you a more interesting example of how dark skin can kind of convey something in a lot of anime, and also I'm going to get a little uncomfortable and make some implications of what different skin tones can mean to a market which doesn't have a ton of white people in there and doesn't have a ton of black people in there, or Indians for that matter, or whatever. You get what I'm saying? Okay. Vinland Saga. Easily one of my favourite animes to come out in a while. Huge fan of a show. I could go on about it a lot. By your average, like, Anglo-American kind of lens, it would be a mostly white cast. So why does the main character of the first 4 episodes look kind of almost Arabic? Why does he have darker skin, very black jet hair? Why does he kind of have this Arabic look? Well, the answer to me is probably not that he's Arabic. He looks darker skinned because he's meant to appear more masculine. He is so strong that he literally can take out anyone more barely harming them. He's almost like a fantasy which none of the characters you will follow later on can really live up to. He is the ultimate of Vinland Saga. The Ubermensch, if you know, the Ubermensch wasn't like some nihilistic, ugly creation designed around the idea of fuck everyone else, I do what I want, I'm strong. That's basically why he has a darker skin tone, to kind of make him look more powerful, more masculine. And yeah, this goes for other stuff. So let's take Zelda, because this franchise, predominantly aimed at a worldwide demographic, is actually very interesting to talk about when it comes to skin tones and some uncomfortable implications. So the very first Zelda with like a noticeably cinematic story, as I'd call it, was Ocarina of Time, the first one to really be 3D. And the bad guy was like a dark-skinned, Arabic-looking dude, and I feel like that was kind of to convey his, you know, his design. It's partly part of a story that he comes from this desert tribe, and it's partly to convey him as kind of a powerful figure. Now, Nintendo, I feel, has kind of realised that having a series that's defined by a light-haired, kind of blonde young guy defeating a dark-skinned, sort of Arabic, maybe you could see him as black-looking dude, over and over again, might be a bit unintentionally problematic. So, what did it do? Well, they've gradually been turning him green. If you watch the different games, you'll watch him slowly go from brown to just obsidian to starting to gain greenish skin until he's where he is now, where his skin colour is basically green. Okay, well, stuff's going to get even weirder, because let's talk briefly about some other characters. So we've got Zelda, title character, not always in the games, princess, you get it. And then you got her dad, who appears now and again, infrequently. Now, her dad, for some reason, very dark skin tone. Reason, same as Ganondorf's, basically. But yeah, does it make any sense? Like, no, it doesn't. But what's weirder is there's a bit of a trope I've noticed happens in 2 of the games where Zelda takes on some kind of disguise and is then revealed, like, towards the end to be Zelda. And what's interesting is this disguise isn't just like an outfit, it's like her skin colour completely changes. So, Ocarina of Time, first time they do this, I don't know. I'm not sure what she's meant to be. She looks kind of like a ninja. I don't know, maybe Asian, who knows? Like I said, Japanese does not actually matter that much when you think about race. Okay, so next we go on to Wind Waker, and here it's more distinct because she's actually like much more of a running character throughout the whole story. But what's interesting is, okay, so she transforms, loses dark skin and blonde hair. Yeah, just loses the dark skin, I forgot. Yeah, I don't know, did she de-blacken up? And what is weirder is this basically also includes a full-on personality change. Like, it's like she completely switches who she is. I think this is linked probably to fairly generic social expectations, so to speak. It is true that women tend to, on average, be lighter skinned than men across various ethnic groups. It is true that darker skin is associated more with masculinity. So when a female character goes from being like a Tom Gill adventurer type to like a cute ultra like pink princess type, skin colour switches. It's cartoon logic applied by Japanese people, but it has a basis in people's own perceptions. Going back to Osamu Tezuka and something like his Cleopatra, I don't think it's a coincidence that of the Egyptian characters, Cleopatra is the one who has the palest skin tone, because it's associating her as kind of being sexy and effeminate more so than the rest of the Egyptian cast. Don't get me into the whole Cleopatra's ethnicity thing. I don't want to touch it. I'm gonna leave that for someone else. But yeah, there's my uncomfortable theory on Japan and skin colour. Basically, more masculine, darker skin, less masculine, more lighter skin. Although, you know, guys can still be very masculine with a light skin tone, but you know, if you're emphasising sheer physical power, Japan loves to give them a darker skin tone, and yeah, that's just a trope there. And that's what I mean by it's less about race and more about what it conveys with the character's image, because we are not talking about this, we're talking about society which is like 99.9% Asian. So yeah, sensitivities and concerns are a little different. Okay, so let's briefly talk about the Japanese far right, because this is going to be an interesting little area. You see, Japan has a bit of a weird thing with its history. It's not just the fact that war crime denial is pretty popular there. It's not just that for a while the best-selling book was about how to argue with Koreans, e.g. a population enslaved by the Japanese for a good chunk of World War II. It's also that certain chunks of the Japanese far right are completely in denial about Japan's actual ethnic background. E.g., the Japanese are basically Chinese. Native Japanese exist in small clusters. And one of the more interesting bits of trivia I found out was that Japan kind of has a thing for trying to address its own issues through issues from other cultures. So, if you ever heard about the Ainu or Bromokumin, I think I just butchered that pronunciation, think of them as native Japanese tribes. But what's interesting about Japanese pop culture is, in trying to portray them, they seem to often draw on Western pop culture. So, there's this Tezuka manga, and it's a bit of a Pocahontas thing. Now here's the thing, Tezuka's original manga, it portrays the non-Japanese, the native Japanese, as looking kind of white. Like, they kind of look almost like Asterix characters in a way. So, this gets a movie adaptation. I'm not sure if it's straight to DVD, straight to VCR, it might be. Okay, now they look kind of Native American. Full Metal Alchemist. Big theme about, racism, war, blah blah blah. Now, this seems to be drawing inspiration from, European and Arab conflicts, particularly modern stuff. According to the author, though, it's partly inspired by the Ainu. Like I said, Japan viewing things somewhat differently. Another thing is just that this partly comes because the Japanese far right is pretty goddamn powerful. Like, you think our anti-SJW guys making big YouTube videos about woke Disney are bad. No, these guys will rustle up a massive protest. They'll be screaming on loudspeakers. There's plenty of times where major publishers have, apologised, removed stuff to try and appease these guys. And it's led to a weird case where sometimes, Japanese social issues get moved on to stories set in more Western settings because it's just more marketable to set them not just a fantasy setting like we often do, but even a Western setting because you're more likely to get published. So there you go, we've made the situation even messier. Man, this started off as a simple thing to explain that, Naruto wasn't actually meant to be white. Another big thing with Japan, some of you guys might not be aware of, is blackface and I guess whiteface are still very much a thing. This exists in weird areas. So, for example, Japanese youth and fashion culture for a good chunk was absolutely fine with applying wigs and makeup and stuff like that to make themselves resemble different ethnicities. That is based on a real fashion trend, and we can partly blame Naomi Campbell. They still kind of do this. Live action adaptations of a lot of anime will just use Japanese characters even if the characters aren't even Asian. The Full Metal Alchemist, that live action movie series, has no problem using wigs and makeup to give Japanese actors the looks of other ethnicities. Look at this trailer from this movie about ancient Rome and baths, this romantic comedy drama thing, which I think was a big hit. And they're literally just casting a Japanese actor as a Roman dude, and once again just using a bit of makeup, and there you go. Also, another good example of how Japan do not see themselves as having squinty eyes. They see themselves more as flat faces, I guess. I think the idea of of a more attractive Caucasian guy is less the nose, which is seen as weird, and more the idea of like a stronger jaw and a more bumpy face. I'm pretty sure that's the idea of what's maybe uniquely more appealing. Well, yeah, the noses are definitely seen as a weird thing to the Japanese. But yeah, there you go. There's an example. Flat face. If they do not see themselves as having a. I'm not doing the right thing. I said.
Just a quick intermission. So if it wasn't really clear at this point, no one in fucking Japan would ever call someone a fucking round eye. That is purely Western projection on our own physical appearance versus their projection. I've heard some interesting like terminology thrown about. Something comparing like Western facias to like a lumpy soup or something like that, which would obviously we would like find completely bizarre, but I guess that's why they perceive themselves as like a flat face versus us, who, you know, think of them as like we go more for the eyes, I guess.
So let's briefly talk about Pokemon, e.g. the most profitable multimedia franchise ever. I haven't played Pokemon since the original Game Boy, so I'm not really up to date on it. What I do know is they've started to remake the games, which sort of makes sense. Video game remakes are going crazy right now and everything is getting a remade edition. You can partly blame it on the fact that games can't as easily just be ported over to newer technology like a film remaster. A lot of the time it relies on a lot of weird tinkering. So hey, remakes, easy way to get a ton of money, and hey, it's probably a lot quicker than designing something all new. But what's interesting, once again, shows that very Japanese unconcern is the newer Pokemon games let you choose not just your character's gender, something they introduced from like the second set of installments, but also let you change their skin colour. Once again, very smart, obvious choice, get a wider market, let people create characters which maybe more represent them. But here's the thing, when they remade some of the older games,
Omega Ruby and Alpha Sapphire, to be precise. I had to Google this stuff, so this is why we're suddenly cutting out, because I want to be exact. Okay, so basically when they introduced the option to change gender and went back and remade some of the earlier games, they added that into there. They didn't initially do this with skin colour, so after introducing an option to change the character's skin colour, then they remake an older game, they don't include that feature in that older game, which technically accurate, but it's all weird that they would go back and change their older games to include an option to select the player character's gender, but not do the same for skin colour. Obviously they changed that with later installments, but it is a pretty good example of how something like this maybe isn't of great concern to a Japanese company without being like told directly by its consumer base that yeah, we want this feature.
It shows Nintendo as a Japanese company's absolute kind of denseness to concerns of what people would want or take offence at, or you know, it shows that absolute lack of understanding. If you want an example of a company which isn't Nintendo, you can look at something like Resident Evil 5. Quite an old controversy now, but everything about the backlash to that trailer, to me, doesn't speak of what critics refer to as something which, you know, no black person worked on, but more to something that was not really in the peripheral vision of that many Americans versus Japanese. A Japanese company doesn't necessarily have to realise how insensitive this trailer can look to some people. Now, personally, I think Japan sometimes gets off a bit clean with the idea that it's just culturally ignorant of certain subjects. Believe it or not, people from other cultures can just not really give a fuck and be a bit tasteless because they don't care that much.
Got to declare this the end of what will maybe be a part one and say, hey, I can follow this up, I've got more, but at the same time, I've kind of had this lying around on my computer for like 3 months now, and I just want to wrap it up at this point and maybe come back to this subject with perhaps a less messy, more concise kind of follow along, as opposed to just adding more and more to what's already a fairly bloated video. So what would I say at the end of this? What summarises it? Well, for one thing, if you're seeing characters like, say, the Lupin cast, you might think they don't look that Japanese, but that may just be your own perception of what Japanese looks like. Hell, I've got some old Xbox magazines lying about somewhere. Sadly, I think I probably don't have the one where they drew Shigeru Miyamoto as like an obese samurai, but, you know, it was that old console war, like early 2000s era, so, you know, behaviours and what's considered acceptable do change. Yes, there's basically, first of all, most characters are probably Japanese. Next of all, a lot of anime which is popular in like the West is probably stuff that is either aimed at either A, kids or teens, or B, stuff that is probably going for that kind of mo otaku, slightly dorky demographic, which is why you'll probably see a lot more plain, as I put it, very generic looking character designs and art styles, which probably is part of why we maybe have a bit of confusion of what ethnicity characters are meant to be. Next of all, any obsession with Japanese eyes is completely like, no, it's something they have no idea about. Like, Japan does not particularly spend their time thinking about how they have small squinty eyes. That just does not happen. That is just, I've seen very little in my long trudge through Japanese pop culture, including looking into like weird, bizarre stuff like Tokyo Tribe or whatever. Maybe I'll bring that up next video. Stuff like that to suggest they have much of an awareness, but maybe we see them as having small eyes. That's one of those weird things I remember my mum dropping of, like, oh, it's weird, they have big eyes in their animes, but they don't. You get what I'm throwing down. My point is that, yeah, consider that. And next of all, yeah, this is sort of a goodbye for now, because I want to return to this topic, but I also don't want to just have this video lying on my hard drive waiting for me to finish it. So that's going to be me off for now. Goodbye.